Hello and welcome to this special episode of Crosshairs. Well, you were expecting my colleague Praveen Swami to be here, but he's on a break and hence I'm trying to fill in his shoes. Uh, Today for Crosshairs, we've chosen a very important topic. And the topic is, the growing axis, or should I say the Sino-Russia axis, that is the China-Russia axis, what it means for India, and what interest does US really have, or what do the US really, how do they look at this particular axis that is growing? And for this, I have with me two very distinguished guests who know this subject very well, like back of the hand. I have with me the print columnist and the China expert, Aadil. And he's right now based in Taiwan. And he's someone you would have read his columns. Do log on to the print website, go to the opinions section, read his columns. Aadil Brar, he writes wonderfully well, and he gives us a very insight into the way China functions, the way China thinks. Also, I have with me Ms. Swasti Rao. She is the Associate Fellow at the MPIDSA, that is the Manohar Parrikar Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis. She is someone who is very focused on Europe and is someone who has just written a recent article on the collaboration that is happening between China and Russia when it comes to tech. So thanks a lot for joining us on this show, both of you. Welcome to the print.
Thank you.
Thank you, Snehesh.
So, Aadil, my first question to you is, there's a talk about the Sino-Russo axis. Is there anything called axis that is already there, or is it an axis that is developing?
If we read the documents that talk about China-Russia partnership, they talk about limitless partnership, and that has been the case for at least last 2 decades. And if we look at the long history of Cold War, they've had difficult relations, and sometimes they've had better relations. But in the present context, they have pretty good relation despite what we've seen in Russia-Ukraine context. China is still backing Russia in its aims of achieving the goal in Ukraine, whatever goal that President Putin has set out. They might not explicitly support the war, but they are funding the war through other means, by buying trade, other stuff that helps the war, or actually buying oil, which is directly funding the Russian system. So they're not exactly buying or selling them weapons which could fund the war, but they are indirectly supporting the war. So that is the basis of this partnership. And this partnership keeps expanding in different affairs. So they collaborate on challenging NATO, the West. And it's also something that they both believe in, an idea of challenging NATO in Europe and challenging US in Asia. So these are the common interests that align in their partnership, and that's how they work together. So, and I think it's going to expand from here on, though Russia might appear to be a weak partner, but it will not stop at the point where it is.
Okay. Swasti, Aadil mentioned a very important thing that, Russia and China have a strategic relationship that has been there for nearly about 2 decades. Swasti, but in 2022, in the run-up to the Winter Olympics, after which, the whole Ukraine invasion really began, there was a summit between President Xi Jinping and President Putin of Russia. And the summit really said that Russia, and they really upgraded their ties and said, and I quote, "No limits partnership that surpasses alliances." So, Swasti, do you think that an axis is developing, or you feel that the axis is already developed? Now it is taking more contours into it.
Right, Snehesh, I think there's little doubt when we say that regardless of the outcome of the war, and a point that I have been trying to make for a time now, which is that regardless of the outcome of the war, what we will see is that Russia is pushed further into the lap of China. And when I say further, of course, I'm building on from this no limits friendship declaration or announcement that we saw happening or coming a few weeks just before the war in Ukraine began. Now, what the war in Ukraine has shown as to what exactly do the two countries or the two leaders mean when they say a no limit friendship? Because see, the first thing that comes to anybody's mind is that, of course, China would be there to support Russia in different ways, right? In economically, Aadil mentioned that about the hydrocarbon sales, especially the energy sales, from the oil and gas sales from Russia. It'll be there to sort of fill in the space that is left after the European countries have stopped buying oil and gas from Russia. The second thing that it could do, China would try to politically back Russia. So those are the ways in which we expected China to really back and help Russia. I think if we look at the last 1 year of the war and see how this unfolding has happened, right? And how this no limit friendship has unfolded, I think it's been a bit of a mixed bag. And I think even the idea around the hydrocarbon sales is not really something which is understood well. So if you ask me specifically, I see that the no limit friendship that was announced in a very grand manner before the war began can actually, if you look at what happened in 2022 and how the trends are for 2023, what you see is that Russia can be helped by China in certain ways. The first thing is that definitely China can, like I said, that buy more hydrocarbon. They are doing that, but there is a limit to it, which is that if you closely understand what China's pattern has been, and Aadil would correct me if I'm wrong, that China is extremely wary and careful of not developing an over-dependency, right? And when I say this, in China, there is a policy of not really getting more than 200 million barrels of oils from one country alone, precisely for this reason of trying to check the over-dependency. And then also what the war in Europe has shown is that Russia is not really a reliable partner when it comes to, honoring contracts and promises. So I think China is also taking stock of that. The surge that we saw in hydrocarbons has already happened. If you look at a lot of other economic analysis that is coming on, especially the energy sales from Russia to China, they say that there'd be a plateau. And in 2023, one should not expect a very high, so to say, or disproportionately high sales from Russia to China to go any further than what they've already reached at. That's one. And the second thing that kind of backs this argument is that China recently has gotten into two long-term contracts with Western firms. And I think the logic is simply that they are not willing to become over-dependent on one country for their energy. That's one. The second thing, like I said, that they can politically help, Russia in many ways. And one of the ways in which they can politically help Russia, they've been doing that by rhetoric. I think we all see that, how they've been calling out on unilateral sanction regime, etc. But more concretely, I think what they can do is that, and China has been doing it, because if you see what happened when Wang Yi had gone to Europe in his recent European tour, he actually skipped Brussels and he went to Hungary. And we all know why he went to Hungary, because Hungary is a country, and especially under Viktor Orban, who has more favorable ties, not just favorable impression, not just of Russia, but also very good ties with China. So in short, what I mean to say is that Wang Yi and China, they are mindful of this wedge that exists. I mean, the European solidarity and unity is not perfect. And they would try to drive that wedge deeper by trying to divide the European countries so that the European bloc, the EU bloc, is unable to come up with a fresh tranche of sanctions, say, or anything very concrete compared to what has already happened. So that is the political way in which they can do it. The third is by circumventing sanctions, and I think circumventing sanctions is something that the US has been very, very vocal about recently. You saw that Antony Blinken went to Kazakhstan, he went to Turkey. I mean, not him, but somebody else from the US had gone to Turkey, because I think what the sanction regime is also understanding is that if there are sanctions, there'll be ways to circumvent them, and sometimes it can get very difficult to identify who's circumvented those sanctions because of quasi-corporate contracts that are difficult to identify. And I've talked about that in my work also. So I think the sanction regime is also evolving to sort of, try to make the enforcement better. But like I said, that gray area will always remain. What Absolutely. China is wary of, and I'm just concluding, what China is wary of, that China definitely wants to help Russia. They have a deepening of cooperation, but China would not want to do it at the cost of their economic ties with both the US and the West, and the EU particularly. So I think that is where it stands. There's a lot of gray zone, and we'll talk about it more.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot for that. Adil, you both mentioned about, the growing economic ties between the two. For example, to think of it, in the last year, 2022 itself, the import of Chinese oil from Russia has grown by 60%. Also, another important factor on the energy front is that uh, Russia has now replaced Indonesia as China's biggest coal exporter, in the sense that Chinese are now buying more coal from Russia. So Russia is the largest exporter of coal to China now. In among all this, we perfectly understand that, I think China and Russia follow the policy of an enemy's enemy is a friend, and the common enemy between both of them is the US. But in this whole scheme of things, Adil, where does India really fit in? India and Russia have a very historic, long-lasting relationship. About 70% of our defense equipment is still of Russian origin. Right from, let's say, the erstwhile or the aging MiG-21 fleet to the most modern S-400 air defense systems, to tanks, everything is Russian. In 2019 and 2020, just for the viewers as a background, in 2020, when the LAC tensions began, India did reach out to Russia for a lot of missiles and other equipment, which were delivered over time, and they were delivered fast. But then things have changed in 2022. So, Adil, where does India really stand to gain or lose when it comes to this axis between Russia and China?
Thank you for that question. Before I come to the point about India, I just want to mention one thing. The Chinese response to the war in Ukraine has been interesting because we cannot paint the whole response in one color. There are certain companies like the drone maker in China and some of the other companies that left Russian market have their own economic interest in mind. So we can't really say that all these companies in China are kind of coordinating their actions with what the government says. So it depends on which sector you're looking at. So certain companies like Huawei are still there in Russia. And similarly, the banking system that the Chinese offer is still operating in Russia. So this is how the Chinese system is funding the war indirectly by supporting these systems, by allowing them to circumvent the sanctions which are in place right now. And I think so. It's a very complicated topic, and we'll be able to understand this the impact of the Chinese support for Russia maybe in the long run. But at this point, I think it's important to leave it where it is, that it's not easy to tell exactly how China seems to be supporting. There are some places where there's strong support, and some places there isn't as big support. But the companies are also thinking about their interest when they do these things about leaving the Russian market. And now coming to the point about where does India fit into this equation, what India should think about the China-Russia equation. And I think, as Swasti was mentioning earlier, that Russia is going into the Chinese lab more and more. And that's something India should be wary about, I would say. We have to carefully examine how dependent is Russia on China, whether it's their banking system. If we are buying oil, are we indirectly supporting China or the Chinese banking system through that network? So we'll have to be more mindful about how dependent Russia becomes over time and how to balance that dependency in terms of our own reliance on the military front and purchase of S-400 and other weapon systems that are key to the military establishment here in India. And so we'll have to carefully look at our response. And I also think the way this war is going, Russia will come out as a weak partner. That's a fair conclusion. I think there's nobody that's saying otherwise, except some people on RT. Maybe they don't agree, but most of the people would say Russia will come out as a weak partner. And China will definitely make sure that they use that opportunity to either buy assets. And so similarly, what does that mean for India? It also means that in diplomatic affair, Russia will not have the same kind of bargaining power, maybe at the UN. And that will have a huge impact on how we have done business with Russia all these years. Can Russia really make their independent decisions at the UN? Can we rely on Russia for other, diplomatic bargaining aspects? I don't think we can, and that will change over time. And we'll have to look at how China pulls the levers of Russian politics, and China will be looking at gaining more influence in internal politics in Russia. Though Chinese have not been good at this kind of internal influencing mechanism, they've done some in Canada, they tried in Sri Lanka, but they'll definitely attempt to gain more access to Russian politics.
And I think you're absolutely right. I also fear that in this whole thing, that China is going to emerge stronger rather than Russia emerging stronger thanks to China. Swasti, when you look at this axis, there is no doubt about the fact that given our historic background, Russia is not going to sacrifice its relation with India to please China. But one thing is also absolutely sure, that Moscow is also not going to back India fully when it comes to India's policy against China. Is that a worry, somewhere, that because of this Russian dependence on China, our relationship with Russia is going to get affected, and our ability to circumvent some of the larger global order will be limited, as Aadil said, Swasti?
Right, Snehesh, I think there's very little doubt on the fact that the war is going to, it definitely is not in India's favor. Let me start there. But whether we like it or we don't, Russia is going to emerge a diminished power. Adil just said that it's going to emerge weaker. There's no denying that. And we have been traditionally using Russia, right, for certain foreign policy objectives. There has been what I've been calling the Russia toolkit, India's Russia toolkit. Okay, so India's Russia toolkit has had certain objectives, and that India has been doing pretty successfully, because coming from the fact that India is a multi-aligning country, a middle order power which believes in multipolarity, etc. So I think coming and the fact that India rejects an alliance worldview, doesn't really want to join alliances, and wants to keep its strategic autonomy, and wants to align with different poles. So I think coming from that vantage point, it makes a lot of sense for India to have a potent enough Russia in our neighborhood, because through which we've been discussing about it again and again. But there are the continental concerns that India has with respect to balancing China, and our outreach in the Central Asia, the North-South Maritime Corridor. It is important because it is probably the only big business venture where neither China nor Pakistan are yet parties. Okay, so I think those are things, and are this entire diplomacy around the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and how we balance that. And I think to sum it up, one sentence would sum it up nicely, which is that India is really wary of an Asian order which is led by China, and for that we've been using Russia in many ways. And then comes the entire picture of the defense dependence. So I think the fact that Russia is going to emerge deeper, whether we like it or don't, and then how far can you really take the statement that Moscow is not willing to affect its ties with New Delhi in a situation where it is ostracized by the world community, having these unprecedented sanctions, which are definitely going to work in the longer run, because that's what the sanctions are for. I think there is a lot of confusion and conspiracy theories right around how and exactly for what are the sanctions put in place. So I think in the longer run, there is no doubt about the fact that Russia is going to emerge more isolated. And like you and everyone here is agreeing to the fact that China would try and help Russia, but Russia would remain a junior partner. And then eventually they have their own problems to settle. So all of that, China would not want to do that at the cost of its, trade ties with either the US or the EU. And I think if you look at the recent posturing that China has come up with, which is that it is the way it has been trying to court Europe and trying to, get the trade and investment deal back on track, which has not been there after the human rights issues cropped up. That's one. The second thing is that if you look at what the Chinese spokesperson said at Davos recently, before some weeks before the Munich Security Conference, they said that China is really looking for a lot of investment from the West, and it's opening up after years of COVID lockdown. So I think it's in a precarious situation in itself. And all of this, there will be, I don't deny the fact that there will be a lot of gray area, but in terms of where it is going for India, I think what it makes sense for India is to grapple with the fact that this order is not the way it was before the war began, and there is no way that this will not be, our equation with Russia will not be affected by whatever is coming up. And on the platter, right, what we have is certain promises that have been made again and again by President Putin, but whether Russia has the capabilities to deliver on those promises, to deliver on the weapons deliveries, and it's not just this, the weapons. If you look deeper, it also goes all the way up to the space cooperation that we had with Russia, and there have been lots and lots of studies. I can quote some of them, that have actually gone into the details of saying that Russia will be unable to actually have the sheer technology to help India with develop its space program, for instance. And those are things, those are primary national interest objectives for India. India, the Indian Air Force has just come with this 2022 doctrine that said that we want to become an aerospace power, right?
Yeah.
And now you see that there is a lot of discussion on how suddenly France is stepping in to fill that gap. So I'm not saying that it is going to happen right away, but I think these are realities and
realities that we need to keep in mind.
Yes.
Aadil, Russia and China, of course, the axis is aimed at the US. They look at cutting the US out from the Eurasia region itself. You have Russia, major power, China, again, a major power, coming together to cut out the US. So where does US really fit in, and where does India and US fit into this larger scheme of things, Aadil?
That's an excellent question. I think when we look at the Russia-China axis, we should not just look at the Eurasian region as something that both want to, make US leave. They are actually looking at a broader strategy which overlaps with what China wants and what Russia wants. Russia is also neighbor to Japan. We should remember that. So they are somewhat of an Asian power in that sense. Though
Absolutely.
they've tried not to play that up, but whenever their interest comes, there's some islands in the region, they have disputes with Japan. And so Russia also plays equally important role. And that is why they've been so concerned about the whole Quad cooperation. Sergei Lavrov mentioned that in New Delhi recently. And that's where
he dissed the Quad, he dissed the AUKUS.
Yeah, exactly. So I think we have to look at broader, regional interests that both these countries have. And that's where India-US cooperation comes in, because India and US are trying to work towards challenging China's belligerent actions in South China Sea and at the border between India and China. And there's that broader understanding between the Quad grouping that China's activities in this region are a challenge to the collective security of the group. So that is why I think Russia aligns with China, because they see that they can also gain something out of it. They can challenge the US tacitly, maybe not in the same kind of way they want to do in Europe and in the Eurasian belt. And they will directly be a challenge to India-US cooperation as well, whether it is in the AUKUS affair or in the Quads affair. And that's where I think Russia has tried to kind of balance the negotiations between India and China by not trying to be too poking their nose in this whole bilateral negotiation that India and China have right now to resolve the border dispute. They want to be party of it because they see that by having that leverage, they can try to keep US outside of the negotiations. Though India is very clear that we don't want Russia's help. They try to ask for some support, but I think New Delhi is more interested in talking directly to Beijing to resolve this dispute. And so I think US and India cooperation will experience some strain, and we buy weapons from Russia in large amounts, and that dependence continues to be a bearing impact on the Indian army. And I think the US is not really making efforts to give us other solutions to that problem. And I think we are trying to find indigenous solutions by developing our own weapon system. And I think as time goes by, Russia's own defense industry will also come under strain, and Chinese defense industry will try to patch that gap that is there right now
Yeah, fill in the shoes.
in the Russian capability. And so we would also have to be mindful about how these Chinese technologies in terms of AI and new technologies that start entering the defense industry, and how does that have an impact on our own capabilities, on our own systems, on our own secure networks. And that's another concern that India and US can work on to make sure that China does not have that kind of overbearing influence on the future defense technologies.
Well, that's a good point that you made, Adil. Especially, when it comes to the US, in this larger scheme of things, India has already signed the 3 foundational agreements with the US. There is a larger cooperation that is taking place. US is really wooing India. India is talking to all sides. It's still not decided its mind. It says that it wants to remain neutral. But the fact is that Russia and China are getting closer, and it's a worry. I'll be the devil's advocate here and ask you, Swasti, is US dependable? Can India really trust the US? US is a country which has a history of choosing partners when it is of their interest, and then leaving the partners like a hot potato when it suits their interest. We have that example in our immediate neighbors with Pakistan, vis-a-vis Afghanistan. So, can India really trust the US? Can India and US develop a close strategic partnership that would be able to circumvent this axis between Russia and China and the growing Chinese influence?
Excellent observation. And I think we all need to be a devil's advocate somewhere, because definitely the fact that India's relationship with Moscow is undergoing the strain because of the war and the way things are happening, it does not really mean that India and US actually become allied partners, and in terms of how the NATO allies are. And I don't think that is going to happen, Snehesh. I think what we need to keep in mind from India's perspective, and that's something that I think India has stood up for also, is that one lesson is that dependence and over dependence on one partner or one bloc can really lead you into trouble. Okay, that's one. So I think in many ways, the war has also taught India a lesson that India already knows and propagates in the world, but I think a kind of a reiteration of sorts, which is that we would like to keep a strategic autonomy intact, and whatever relationship that we are trying to develop with the West and with the US should not really come in the way of how India takes its strategic autonomy seriously, because that, I guess, is a very important thing. That's one. The second, so it also partially answers your question when I say that can India really with closed eyes trust the US? Of course not, and it should not US, not anybody. So that's one. The second thing is that I also understand that, and I'm sure most of you, the two of you would agree that this close proximity that you mentioned, the 3 foundational agreements, you go into details, are actually 4 with India and US. That has also been a product of how China's actions in the South China Sea have actually triggered that unease in the US, and why Indo-Pacific became so important. And when the Western powers started looking at Indo-Pacific, India was the only bankable partner. So it was to do with the India's geographical location, and also with the fact that we have these troubled equations with China. Okay, that has brought India and US together. So one of the reasons why India and US together is not really happening or operating in a vacuum, but also because of the China factor, right? So I would say that from India's strategic calculus, India was using Russia to balance China in the same way in the continental sphere, as much as India was trying to balance China in the on the maritime sphere, and from the Quad initiatives, etc. But if you look at the maritime sphere, the maneuvers there, all the trilaterals and plurilaterals, etc., they become more important because of the fact that not just the US, but every single developed country in the world is looking at the Indo-Pacific, because that is where the trade goes from. So what I just want to say, that while balancing is definitely going to be, I would say, a permanent feature in how India looks at the world and India's worldview. So India would have this balancing Weltanschauung when it comes to foreign policy. But I think what is also important to understand, how much of it is optics and how much of it is substance. So I think when it comes to Russia, India would continue balancing continuing, ties with China and continuing all the cooperation that we have. Of course, taking very seriously the fact that Aadil mentioned and what I've written in my previous article for ThePrint, which is that what about the sensitive technologies? I mean, Huawei is there. Huawei was blocked from the US. Huawei was, thrown out from Europe. Huawei is known to have, for the CCP. And in such a scenario, how far would India really trust Russia too? So I think that optics would still continue with those glitches. But at the same time, if you look at India's maneuvers in the Indo-Pacific and with the West, I think the substance of it has grown considerably. There's no doubt that India's, like I said, cooperation with the West, with Europe, all those things have been growing in substance in many ways that was not imaginable before the war had begun. So in short, like I said, that I don't think we need to trust anybody with closed eyes. We need to take our strategic autonomy very carefully. And I think that also makes sense. Why, Snehesh? Because, beyond all this, also look at how India is posturing itself in the world. And if India wants to continue being the voice of the global South, so that attachment of strategic autonomy is very important to build credibility and sustain credibility around that leadership. So I think those are things which are important. And there's no denying the fact that as the world is going forward in time, there is a rise of multipolarity. So the most Pareto optimal situation for India would be to keep its strategic autonomy in place, but with, I would say, a fair understanding of how the situation and how the world order is changing and trying to develop tools for it, so that we don't find ourselves in a vulnerable point.
So, Aadil, the last question to you. She mentioned about having a strategic autonomy when it comes to such issues. But how long would this strategic autonomy really last if the world is divided? It is getting divided into camps. Right now India is at a perfect position. The Russians are going us. The Chinese want to have better ties, and I feel that the whole LAC thing is because the Chinese wants India to stick to their side rather than get aligned with the US. The US is going us. So India is in a perfect position where it is the bride. There are grooms waiting to catch India's attention, or people who may accuse me of being sexist. I would say it's the boy, and there are multiple girls, who are wooing the boy's attention. But eventually, how long would this eventually last? Do you fear that sooner or later India will have to take a side if the world gets divided into specific camps? Aadil.
Thanks for the question, Snehesh. I think we might have to take sides based on the issue that we are discussing, because India's strength has been this issue-based diplomacy that we are good at, issue-based alliances and meetings at different forums. And depending on what issue we are discussing, like in emerging technologies, there's a lot of common interest with the US. So that's where we might see more convergence with US, Europe, and other Western countries. But on security front, and this is what we've seen with the Quad, there's some concern around how far can we go, where should we go from here. It's kind of slow, and I also believe on the horizon, India will have to look at when the crisis emerge, whether it is in the Taiwan Strait or somewhere, and at that moment it might not be so easy to remain kind of unaligned, because at that point we are looking at economic concerns affecting our own social makeup, and that's where we might have to stand up for our own interests and take one or the other side. And that's when things will become very difficult. It's been easy in case of Russia, Ukraine, because it's somewhat of a problem that's far from us, geographically speaking. But things that might happen in Asia, in Pacific, with Philippines or Japan, they will create trouble, which will be far more difficult to manage in this context.
Or to maneuver.
How to maneuver. So it will be difficult going forward if we see such kind of situation emerge, and we might have to take one or the other side, because then it will be quite clear with what China's interests are, and China is quite clear on what it wants and what it doesn't want. And similarly, now US is also clarifying what it wants and it doesn't want. And in case there's a clarity in terms of what US wants for Taiwan, there's still some they've left it to prediction, and there's some gray area there, how much Taiwan wants, what US wants. And I think that's where, if US starts clarifying what they want for Taiwan, and what Taiwan itself starts clarifying what they want, and that might lead to a crisis in the future, and then it'll be very difficult for India to kind of stand on the side. And there's some thinking within Indian strategic community that we can just stand by and let this kind of unfold on its own. I personally disagree with that, because it'll be very difficult economically and otherwise militarily to kind of stand by and see a crisis kind of unfold. So we will need to take some position in such a scenario.
Well, thank you so much, Aadil. You're absolutely right. In the future, we might have to take that decision. I hope that future is not so near. The future remains only a future. But thank you so much, both of you, for joining us on this lovely discussion. I'm sure the viewers have greatly, immensely benefited out of this discussion. And you both, and we three of us actually agree that this growing Sino-Russo axis is actually a concern for India, and it would need a lot of deft diplomatic handling to ensure that our relationships, don't really get sacrificed in the overall larger scheme of things. So once again, Aadil and Swasti, thank you so much for joining us here on the Print's YouTube channel. Thank you.
Thank you, Aadil.
Thank you, Snehesh. Thank you, Swasti.
Thank you. Thank you.